Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the mysterious world of what happened inside the haunted towns of the American Civil War. But we're going to look at it through the lens of a much older, darker time. A tale of power, betrayal, and hidden truths in a medieval kingdom that mirrors that same devastating internal conflict. Some stories make you question how far humans will go for pride or survival. This is one of them. So dim the lights, take a breath, and if calm yet dark history fascinates you, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Let's travel back in time. The Kingdom of Athuria, a land of rolling green hills and once sturdy stone keeps, had been torn asunder by the agonizing war of the severed crown, a conflict so brutal and rooted in pride that the very earth seemed to weep long after the last arrows fell. This was a civil war in the truest sense, pitting brother against brother, and the arrogance of King Thuron the Unbending was the sharp, poisonous root from which all this suffering grew, a cruelty so profound it etched itself into the very foundation stones of the towns he claimed to rule. King Thuron, whose chin rested upon a velvet cushion of self-importance, had begun his reign by enshrining a series of truly bizarre and heartless decrees, seemingly designed less to govern and more to simply exert his boundless, petty power over every man, woman, and child. One such law, known throughout the afflicted realm as the Decree of the Silent Vigil, was particularly heinous, stating that any village or town that saw more than 5 men leave to join the rebellious Duke Valerius's successionist forces would be immediately placed under a lifetime ban on audible sound between the hours of dusk and dawn. Breaking this rule, even with a whispered prayer or the cry of a starving child, would result in the immediate and excruciating penalty of the Iron Shroud, a torture where the offending party was bound inside a tight metal contraption and left in the open town square, a grotesque spectacle designed to instill abject terror into the remaining, terrified peasantry. It was these towns, smothered under Thuron's oppressive, absurd laws, where the deepest, most persistent hauntings of Athuria took root, places where the silence itself became a screaming, palpable presence that settled into the stones. Our story begins properly with Meister Ilara, a woman of deep, quiet learning, whose duty it was to record the history of this tragic war, not just the battles and dates, but the hidden truth of the suffering, the stories that the proud King Thuron wished to bury beneath his own self-aggrandizing legend. Ilara was not a warrior or a noble, simply a scholar with a sharp quill and an even sharper conscience, moving slowly and calmly across the ravaged landscape, driven by an almost spiritual need to understand what lingering corruption had been left behind. Her journey led her first to the town known as Vicksburg Keep, which had been a thriving center of trade before the war, now a hollow, echoing shell, its central keep scorched black by dragon fire, or so the common folk whispered, though Ilara suspected the more prosaic, yet equally destructive, work of Thuron's siege engines. She arrived just as the perpetual gray twilight was settling in, the kind of heavy, humid evening that promises no comfort and seems to absorb all light and sound. As she entered the main square, the air immediately felt different, thick and cold, even in the late summer heat, a physical pressure that seemed to press upon the eardrums, and she knew instantly that the terrible silent vigil was still, somehow in effect, even though King Thuron himself was now long gone, defeated and captured in a twist of fate only the gods could truly orchestrate. The local baron, Kale, an arrogant, petty man who had slavishly enforced the king's every cruel whim, had been responsible for executing dozens of peasants under the silent vigil. The horror in Vicksburg Keep was the haunting of soundlessness, a reverse haunting where the ghosts were not the ones making noise, but the ones suffering the enforced silence, their presence marked only by a profound, unnatural absence of sound where sound should be. Meister Ilara walked past what was once the local tavern, and she swore she could see the residual movements of the peasants, their mouths moving in conversation, their laughter silently echoing in the spectral plane, but she could hear nothing, only the dull thump of her own heart. It was here that Ilara uncovered the story of Lysandra, a young woman whose infant child had been struck by a sudden, spiking fever during one of the forbidden hours of silence, and in her panicked grief, the mother had let out a single, desperate, agonizing scream, a sound of pure maternal terror that had immediately summoned Baron Kale's brutal guards. Lysandra was subjected to the Iron Shroud, not for rebellion, but for the basic, biological human reaction to loss. The peasant women who had survived and remained in Vicksburg Keep would only speak to Ilara by writing on slate boards, their eyes wide with perpetual fear, even years later, their hands trembling as they scratched out the word Lysandra and pointed toward the shroud's empty, rust-stained platform in the center square. They detailed how the moment Lysandra had died within the shroud, a chilling, sudden whoosh of air had extinguished every lantern and torch in the town, and from that day forward, no child born in Vicksburg Keep ever cried audibly again, only producing a small, silent gasp, a tragic and permanent physiological scar left upon the town's newest generation. This was the nature of the hauntings born of King Thuron's arbitrary cruelty. They were not simple chains and groans, but deep, structural corruptions of life itself, twisted laws that somehow remained in force even without the hand of the lawman, a psychological haunting that had bled into the physical reality of the town. The people of Vicksburg Keep were the living ghosts, silenced by the memory of the Iron Shroud, their voices trapped in the lingering spectral decree. Moving on from the oppressive quiet of Vicksburg, Ilara journeyed north, toward the region known as Shiloh Fields, a vast, flat expanse where one of the war's most brutal and drawn-out battles had occurred, not a battle of tactics, but a battle of sheer, bloody attrition, orchestrated by Thuron's most ruthless general, Lord Ormond. Here, the haunting was of a completely different nature, born not of silence, but of a persistent, debilitating despair that manifested as an endless, cold, light rain that never seemed to stop, turning the fields into a perpetual, muddy morass. The peculiar law that had caused this haunting was the grain tax of starvation, enacted when Thuron realized the successionists were getting better-fed recruits from the farming regions like Shiloh. Thuron declared that all peasant grain must be stored not in their own barns, but in central, guarded royal granaries, and the tax taken would be not a percentage, but everything above what a single man could carry in one trip, essentially ensuring the entire community would hover perpetually on the brink of starvation. When the peasants, driven by the absolute necessity of feeding their families, tried to hide their meager portions, Lord Ormond's troops were ordered to systematically destroy every crop and barn, a scorched earth policy designed to break the will of the people, turning once fertile land into a barren, muddy wasteland, soaked in tears and blood. The true haunting of Shiloh Fields was the ghostly sound of endless, rhythmic marching in the mud, and the phantom smell of mildewed grain and rotting despair. Ilara had to navigate through the deep, clinging mud, her feet slipping with every step, the cold, thin rain soaking her cloak, and as she looked across the barren fields, she saw strange, faint distortions in the fog, the brief, spectral forms of starved children reaching out, their hands thin and translucent, their faces drawn into expressions of eternal, hollow hunger. The haunting here was the visceral, overwhelming feeling of starvation itself, the memory of desperate hunger made physically real. It was in a ruined farmer's hovel that Alara found a diary, half submerged in the muck, belonging to a peasant woman named Marigold, who detailed the day-to-day misery under the grain tax, recounting the agony of watching her neighbor, a strong man named Thomas, try to argue with General Ormond about leaving enough seed grain for the next season. The arrogance of the general had been absolute. He had responded by ordering Thomas to be plowed under the field itself, strapped to a harness, and forced to drag the plow across the muddy earth until he collapsed, eventually dying of exhaustion and internal injury, a barbaric act of cruelty meant to symbolize the king's ownership of the very soil. The spectral marching Alara heard was the phantom movement of Ormond's troops, forever patrolling the field, ensuring the phantom grain was never harvested, the ghostly General Ormond's cruel, cold eyes fixed forever on the misery he had created. This perpetual military watch, an invisible siege that continued years after the war had officially ended, had rendered the land useless, a physical manifestation of the curse placed upon it by the king's greed. During her time near Shiloh Fields, Alara received a clandestine message from Queen Isolde, King Thuron's long-suffering wife, who had been kept under virtual house arrest for most of the war due to her quiet but firm opposition to her husband's barbarity. Queen Isolde, unlike her arrogant husband, possessed a strong moral center and had used her limited influence to secretly aid the suffering peasants, often by providing smuggled medical supplies and seeds. Isolde's message spoke of a third, even more terrifying haunted location, the town of Anderton's Bridge, a strategic crossing point where King Thuron himself had overseen the execution of hundreds of prisoners of war and suspected sympathizers, his vanity demanding a spectacle of merciless power. The law enacted here was the Edict of Necessary Lies, which compelled any citizen, under pain of flaying, to publicly denounce their neighbors, family, or even their spouse if they were suspected of harboring even the slightest successionist leanings, fostering an atmosphere of pervasive paranoia and betrayal. The inherent cruelty was that King Thuron did not care if the accusations were true. He merely enjoyed the spectacle of people turning on each other, watching their communal bonds snap under the pressure of his absolute authority. This was power abuse taken to its ultimate, psychological extreme, and the queen knew that the secret of Thuron's ultimate downfall lay buried within the truth of Anderton's Bridge. When Meister Alara finally arrived at Anderton's Bridge, the air did not feel cold or silent, nor was it saturated with rain, but instead, it was filled with an unsettling, pervasive whispering, a constant, low, indistinct murmuring that seemed to come from the very stones of the ruined bridge and the dark, flowing river below. It was impossible to make out any specific words, but the sheer volume of the combined, continuous sound created a dizzying sense of unease and intense anxiety. The haunting of Anderton's Bridge was the endless, spectral echo of the coerced denunciations, the phantom lies spoken in fear and desperation, a river of spectral, slanderous sound that permeated the town. The few remaining, traumatized inhabitants refused to speak to each other, communicating only through hesitant gestures, their eyes darting constantly. Their entire lives a silent performance of mistrust, an ingrained fear that any spoken word might be misinterpreted or used against them. Alara found the local priest, Father Borislav, huddled in the remains of the chapel, his mind clearly broken by the horrors he had witnessed, endlessly trying to scrub a stain from the stone altar that he claimed was the dried blood of an innocent peasant girl, publicly flayed after her own father had falsely denounced her under the cruel edict of necessary lies. The priest spoke in short, broken gasps, pointing toward the bridge and repeating the same phrase. "They are still speaking, Meister. The lies never stop, they never stop, and the king is listening." The culmination of Thuron's arrogance and cruelty came to a head shortly after the atrocities at Anderton's Bridge. Believing himself invincible, untouchable by the gods or men, he had gathered his forces for a final, decisive assault on Duke Valerius's last stronghold. But the king had not accounted for the cumulative, moral weight of the suffering he had inflicted upon his own people. During the final siege, a terrible supernatural event occurred. As King Thuron rode toward the front line, the air around him suddenly thickened, and his banner, emblazoned with his proud golden lion, spontaneously caught fire, burning down to ash in a matter of seconds. Then a silent, chilling gust of wind swept through his ranks, carrying the smell of mildewed grain from Shiloh, the oppressive silence of Vicksburg Keep, and the dizzying, pervasive whispering from Anderton's Bridge. Thuron's elite guard, hardened and cynical men, suddenly hesitated, their eyes wide with fear, as they swore they saw spectral figures rise from the very earth they marched on, the phantom forms of the starved children, the silent, bound figure of Lysandra in the iron shroud, and the flayed, tortured specter of the innocent girl from Anderton's Bridge, all silently pointing their accusatory fingers directly at the king. This was the king's downfall, not a better army or a clever tactic, but the sheer, overwhelming moral consequence of his own actions, a haunting made real, a cosmic judgment delivered by the victims of his arrogant, unjust laws. The spectral army of the wronged, the silent accusers and the starving ghosts, did not need to fight. Their presence alone was enough to shatter the morale of Thuron's army, who saw the monstrous truth of the man they followed reflected in the eyes of his victims. King Thuron, seeing his men waver and witnessing the ghostly accusers himself, finally broke, his arrogance crumbling into a moment of blinding, primal terror, realizing too late that his absolute power had been entirely self-destructive. He fled the battlefield, only to be captured later, hiding in a peasant's root cellar, a pathetic end for a ruler who had believed himself a god among men. Queen Isolde, who had suffered Thuron's rule in quiet desperation, eventually took a limited regency, not with pride or vengeance, but with a simple, quiet resolve to mend the kingdom, focusing first and foremost on the haunted towns. Meister Ilara, after completing her record, joined the Queen's council, helping to dismantle every unjust law and strange decree, attempting to physically and spiritually cleanse the corrupted places. The silence of Vicksburg Keep began to slowly lift, piece by agonizing piece, as the new children born under a rule of justice began to cry out their first, audible, healthy cries, finally breaking the curse of the iron shroud. The rain over Shiloh fields, though persistent, began to soften, and the local peasants, freed from the grain tax, planted new, hopeful crops, the muddy, haunted fields slowly turning back into life-giving soil. Anderton's Bridge, however, remained the most difficult to heal. The spectral whispering did not stop, the memory of betrayal, too, deeply ingrained in the human heart. It was a haunting that required more than a new law or a new queen. It required a generational commitment to truth and community. The final moral lesson that Meister Ilara carefully inscribed into her final chronicle was this: that the true measure of a ruler and the true foundation of any lasting kingdom is not the strength of its armies, nor the height of its walls, but the justice and compassion embedded within its laws. Any ruler who uses law as a weapon of cruelty, or who indulges in the arrogance of absolute power, thinking that their will is the only thing that matters, will find that the suffering they cause does not simply fade away. It is absorbed by the very ground, the very air, and the very soul of the land, eventually returning as a force of haunting, silent judgment that will inevitably lead to their downfall. The ghosts of the American Civil War towns, much like the spectral victims of Arthuria's severed crown, are not merely relics of the past. They are permanent warnings, soft whispers in the darkness, reminding us that injustice leaves a deeper, more permanent scar than any sword or cannon ever could. This enduring memory of cruelty is the final, endless flow of the true haunting. The task of Meister Alara was never finished, you see, because the ghosts of the severed crown war were not banished. They were simply understood. They became the collective conscience of the newly reformed kingdom, a solemn, ever-present reminder to the new ruling council, and to every king and queen that would follow, that the power to legislate is the power to inflict eternal pain, and that the only true antidote to a haunted town is not exorcism, but genuine, sustained justice. And so, the realm carried on, always listening for the slightest return of that unnatural silence, that endless marching, or that pervasive, dangerous whisper, knowing that the ghost of the arrogant King Thuron's rule still lingered in the air, a breath of cold air across the back of the neck on a dark and quiet night. It's a continuous flowing reality, this memory, an endless story without a final, clear end, only the slow, quiet work of healing. The story of what happened inside those haunted towns, whether Vicksburg Keep or Shiloh Fields, or the places whose names have been lost to the fog of war and time, is a tapestry woven from the threads of power, injustice, and the terrible, lingering cost of human pride. It just keeps flowing, this dark history, seeping into the present, always there. The new council, led by the stoic Queen Isolde, faced a constant, uphill battle against the ingrained fear and the residual spiritual decay left by Thuron's monstrous reign. The fear was the hardest thing to eradicate, manifesting as sudden, inexplicable outbreaks of communal paranoia, especially in the towns that had suffered under the edict of necessary lies. Even as the Queen issued pardons and decreed absolute freedom of speech, the ingrained habit of silence and suspicion remained, a ghostly, mental cage. Alara observed that the haunting had become deeply cultural, a generational trauma passed down not through spoken warnings, but through the instinctual, fearful responses of the parents. A small sound in the night still caused the elders of Vicksburg Keep to physically flinch, and the sight of a poorly harvested field still brought tears to the eyes of the Shiloh farmers, a response rooted in the spectral echo of the grain tax of starvation. The Queen, in a move of profound wisdom that King Thuron would never have contemplated, established a commission of remembering, tasking Alara and a cohort of scholars not with forgetting the horrors, but with meticulously recording and publicly sharing the stories of the victims, treating their suffering as the most sacred text in the realm. It was a recognition that only by shining the bright light of truth upon the darkness could the shadows begin to recede. But the most chilling encounter Meister Alara recorded came much later, after years of slow, painful reconstruction, in a forgotten, small village near Anderton's Bridge called Oak Haven. Oak Haven had been spared the worst of the physical devastation, but it had suffered the most extreme form of the psychological haunting. Here, the townspeople had internalized the edict of necessary lies, so completely that they had formed a bizarre, self-policing society. Every morning, the entire village would gather, and each person would, without coercion, offer one necessary lie about a neighbor or family member, an unsubstantiated accusation designed to preempt any possible charge against themselves. This was not fear of the crown, but fear of the system the crown had created, a spectral law that had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The haunting here was no longer a phantom whisper, but a living, destructive ritual, a community willingly poisoning itself with the ghost of Thuron's law. Ilara spent weeks in Oakhaven, not writing in her chronicle, but simply listening, observing the slow, calm-voiced destruction of human connection, the eerie, emotionless recitation of the daily lie, a mechanical, ritualized betrayal. She realized that the greatest tragedy of King Thuron's reign was the successful institutionalization of cruelty, turning the victim into a perpetuator of the crime. The moral was not simple or clean, but complex and persistent, much like the hauntings themselves. The kingdom learned that one does not simply defeat an arrogant king. One must also defeat the corrosive philosophy of injustice that he leaves behind, the spiritual and mental debris that continues to victimize long after the tyrant is gone. The story of Athuria's haunted towns became a solemn ballad, sung quietly by the new generation, a continuous narrative of caution whispered against the seductive pull of absolute power, and the terrible, silent scream of the perpetually wronged. The flow of time would heal the land, but only the continuous flow of truth and remembrance could truly heal the soul. And so, the candle flickers on the desk of Meister Ilara, and the quill continues its slow, solemn work, documenting a history that refuses to be forgotten. The silence waits, the rain falls, and the whispers flow, a gentle, dark reminder that some wounds are too deep for time alone to close. The silence waits, the rain falls, and the whispers flow, a gentle, dark reminder that some wounds are too deep for time alone to close. The Meister's focus in Oakhaven became a slow, quiet excavation of the soul, a realization that the cruelty of King Thuron had not just inflicted pain, but had engineered a terrifying form of self-sabotage, convincing people that the only way to survive was to willingly destroy their own moral compass. Ilara spent her days sifting through the remains of the old magistrate's house, looking not for gold or weapons, but for the remnants of paper, the brittle, faded documents that held the true, documented history of the town's collapse. She was searching for the catalyst, the foundational breaking point where the fear had shifted from an external threat to an internal, ritualized practice. It was in the damp, crumbling cellar, hidden beneath a stack of rotten firewood, that she found a single, scorched leather-bound ledger, the cover melted and cracked, titled simply, "The First 100." This ledger, written in the crabbed hand of the long-dead, terrified magistrate, detailed the initial victims of the Edict of Necessary Lies. The entries were chilling in their stark simplicity, listing the name of the accused, the name of the accuser, and the charge, all fabricated, all acknowledged by the magistrate as untrue, yet all enforced under the penalty of the iron shroud or, in many cases, immediate hanging. The magistrate had kept the ledger as a desperate, silent plea to history, a record of the terrible things he was forced to do to save his own miserable life. The entry that finally broke the code of Oakhaven was the 53rd, the denunciation of a miller named Silas by his own younger sister, Anya. The charge was absurd, that Silas had secreted away a single, royal purple velvet ribbon given to him by a successionist scout, a clear sign of treason. Ilara knew the ribbon meant nothing. It was a desperate, transparent lie by Anya to save herself after a neighbor, panicked by a sudden visit from Thuron's guard, had denounced her first. Silas, the honest miller, was hanged on the very beam of his mill, and the spectral haunting in Oakhaven was rooted in the image of his final, silent gaze upon his sister, a look of profound, heart-shattering disbelief and sorrow. The sound that permeated Oakhaven, alongside the constant flow of indistinct whispers, was the phantom creaking of that mill beam, an eternal, high-pitched lamentation that only those who listened very closely, like Meister Ilara, could truly discern beneath the sound of the wind. Ilara realized that the spectral whispers were the endless flow of lies, but the creaking was the sound of a broken trust, the single, unhealable wound in the town's heart. She sent a secret, urgent plea to Queen Isolde, describing the situation not as a matter of law, but as a crisis of the soul, a spiritual infection that was more dangerous than any army. Queen Isolde, a woman whose eyes held the permanent sadness of 1,000 witnessed injustices, understood immediately. She knew that the fear-based society King Thuron had cultivated could only be undone by an equally radical, trust-based decree, one that reversed the entire emotional economy of the land. The Queen issued a new decree, broadcast by royal heralds, not with trumpets and drums, but with the quiet dignity that marked her new rule, a deliberate contrast to Thuron's bombast. This new law was called the Edict of Conscience and Restoration. It did not merely abolish the Edict of Necessary Lies. It actively reversed the penalties, decreeing that anyone who knowingly made a false accusation against another would have their own assets, lands, wealth, and titles, immediately forfeited and distributed among the victims of King Thuron's injustice, a financial and social ruin that was far more potent than any physical torture. Furthermore, the decree mandated that the accuser must spend one full cycle of the moon in the town square, offering a continuous, public apology for the damage caused to the communal trust. The shockwaves were immediate and profound. The peasants, long accustomed to their lives holding no value, suddenly saw their trust given a monetary worth, a profound, visible consequence that finally outweighed the old, spectral threat of Thuron's terror. The ritual of the necessary lie in Oakhaven sputtered to a halt, not because of the new law's penalty, but because the sheer weight of what they would lose, their perceived security, finally outweighed the fear of the invisible, spectral power. The slow healing of Oakhaven began with an unprecedented wave of genuine confessions, as people, burdened by years of silence and ritualized deceit, finally broke down and confessed the truth about their neighbors, their family, and their own roles in the tragedy. The whispers on the bridge did not disappear instantly, but they began to change, the cacophony of lies slowly, agonizingly, giving way to the quiet, spoken torrent of long-suppressed truths. The creaking of the phantom mill beam, however, remained, a permanent sound reminding them of Silas, the miller, the martyr of a broken trust. Queen Isolde and Meister Ilara spent the next decade engaged in this continuous, slow-motion battle against the lingering spiritual wreckage of Thuron's civil war. They learned that each haunted town required not a single, grand solution, but a precise, tailored antidote to the specific form of cruelty that had been inflicted. The ghost of the arrogant ruler was not a single entity, but a hydra of 1,000 bureaucratic cruelties, each requiring its own form of justice and restoration. In Vicksburg Keep, where the haunting was the unnatural silence, the Queen invested royal funds not in building new walls, but in commissioning a massive, public-funded project to teach all the children the lost songs and rhymes of their ancestors, encouraging a culture of loud, boisterous, joyous noise to actively combat the persistent spectral quiet. The town, once frozen in fear, began to thrum with the sound of children's laughter and peasant folk songs, a continuous, intentional resistance against the ghost of the silent vigil. The greatest difficulty, Alara noted in her chronicle, lay in the nobility and the few surviving cronies of King Thuron, the arrogant men who still believed that their blood and their titles gave them the right to cruelty. Many of these lesser barons and petty nobles, stripped of their power but not their pride, continued to enforce bizarre, localized laws in their own small territories, mirroring Thuron's abuse on a miniature scale. One such man was the self-important Baron Alaric, who, after losing most of his lands in the new Edict of Conscience, still held a small valley where he had enacted the law of the noble shadow, which stated that any peasant whose shadow accidentally fell upon the baron's path while he was riding through the town would be immediately flogged for insulting the noble silhouette. It was a ridiculous law, a final, absurd gasp of a dying vanity, but it was enforced with chilling severity. Meister Ilara personally traveled to Alaric's valley, presenting him not with a royal guard, but with her massive, official chronicle, the meticulously documented history of Thuron's downfall, complete with the chilling accounts of the Iron Shroud and the grain tax. She read Alaric the chapter on the downfall of King Thuron, recounting how the king's pride had been shattered by the spectral army of the wronged, reading in a calm, steady voice that was far more menacing than any shout. She did not threaten him with Queen Isolde's army. Instead, she simply told him that his own vanity, his own noble shadow law, was destined for inclusion in the next volume of the Chronicle, destined to be read by all future rulers as an example of the petty cruelty that brings about total ruin, ensuring his lasting legacy would be one of ridicule and infamy, forever catalogued alongside the monstrous Thuron. The arrogance of the small Baron Alaric, ironically, withered not under the threat of violence, but under the terrifying threat of truthful documentation and the judgment of history. He rescinded the law the very next day, his final act of self-importance being to choose obscurity over eternal shame. The moral of this continuous, flowing story, the lesson that Queen Isolde and Meister Ilara imprinted upon the scarred soul of Athuria, was that true power is not the ability to inflict suffering without consequence, which was Thuron's fatal error. Instead, true, lasting power resides in the ability to acknowledge suffering, and more importantly, to reverse the forces of injustice so thoroughly that the spectral consequence, the haunting, is starved of the fear and cruelty that sustained it. The physical scars on the land would eventually fade, the scorched stones would crumble and be replaced, but the spiritual and legal foundations had to be rebuilt on a bedrock of justice, recognizing that every single unjust law, no matter how small or ridiculous, has the potential to spawn a new, persistent, heartbreaking haunting. The Meister's quill finally paused, years after the war had ended, as she finished the last page of her life's work. She looked out at the newly rebuilt kingdom of Athuria, a land still scarred, but no longer truly haunted. The silence was mostly gone from Vicksburg, replaced by the lively, if sometimes raucous, sounds of community. The rain still fell on Shiloh, but now it nourished crops, not sorrow. And the whispers near Anderton's bridge had mostly subsided, replaced by the quiet, hesitant tones of people slowly learning how to trust each other again, their voices no longer poisoned by the ghost of the necessary lie. Ilara's final thought, inscribed as a continuous flow of wisdom at the very end of her chronicle, was that arrogance and cruelty are simply different names for the same tragic blindness, a flaw in a ruler that convinces them they are the exception to the rule of consequence. But consequences are not governed by kings. They are governed by a continuous, unending moral law that binds the universe. When a king, puffed up with pride, breaks this law, the consequence is not merely a defeat in battle, but a spectral decay, a permanent stain on the land and the soul of the people, a wound that takes not years, but generations of conscious, deliberate kindness and justice to close. The haunted towns of Athuria, much like the spectral memories of Gettysburg or Antietam, stand not as places to be feared, but as continuous, eternal reminders of the price of a ruler's unbounded, self-destructive pride. And that, my friends, is why the quiet work of truth and justice never truly ends, because the ghost of the unrepentant tyrant, the memory of his arrogance, is always, silently, waiting for the first whisper of fear to return. The story, like the flow of the river, goes on. The story, like the flow of the river, goes on, and Meister Elara, having dedicated her life to the careful documentation of suffering and restoration, finally earned a quiet repose. She did not seek a grand estate or a position of high power, for her entire existence had been a testament against the very temptations that had destroyed King Thuron. Instead, she retired to a small stone cottage on the outskirts of Vicksburg Keep, the place where the silence had been the deepest, where the trauma of the Iron Shroud had permanently chilled the atmosphere. It was a conscious choice, a personal, continuous vigil to ensure the ghostly silence never again returned to claim the voices of the innocent. She became a quiet, known fixture in the town, a gentle, listening presence that the newer generations treated not with fear, but with reverence, the living link to the dark, painful history they must never repeat. Years passed, and Queen Isolde, her hair now a silvery white crown, would often ride out to visit Alara, the two women sitting side by side on the cottage porch, listening to the sounds of the recovering kingdom. They spoke less and less of the war, for the need to remember was slowly giving way to the joy of building a life where the old fears held no grip. The children of Vicksburg Keep, the grandchildren of those who had suffered under the silent vigil, ran through the streets with a riotous, joyful loudness that would have been unthinkable a generation prior. Their laughter was a continuous, flowing melody, a tangible exorcism that finally pushed the last, thin veil of the spectral silence from the air. This was the true healing, the sound of uninhibited freedom, the auditory proof that the unjust law had been utterly defeated by the simple, human right to express joy and fear and life without consequence. Ilara's final reflections, made to Queen Isolde on one of their quiet evenings, became the final, unwritten moral of the chronicle. She noted that the hauntings of Athuria, like the hauntings that linger in the history of any great civil conflict, were not curses from a distant deity, but the inevitable, moral echo of human choices. The arrogance of one man had created 1,000 ghosts, but the quiet, persistent compassion and humility of one queen and the unflinching truth of one Meister had slowly, deliberately, laid them to rest. She observed that even now, on certain humid, quiet nights, if you stood on the old, scarred spot where the Iron Shroud had rested, you could sometimes catch a momentary quickening of the air, a fleeting sensation of cold, an almost imperceptible hint of that old, terrifying stillness, a reminder that the evil had been defeated, but never truly erased. The specter of cruelty is a permanent scar on the historical soul, a warning stitched into the fabric of time. This scar, however, was no longer a source of panic, but a tool for wisdom, a collective lesson kept alive by the gentle voices of the storytellers and the just laws of the Queen. It taught them all that the true terror of the past was not the marching of an army, but the silence of the oppressed, the whisper of the lie, and the gnawing hunger of the neglected. Their vigilance, their commitment to justice and truth, had to be as continuous and flowing as the river that ran beneath Anderton's bridge, never stopping, always moving forward. Meister Alara lived to see the kingdom truly flourish, a testament to the power of a just aftermath, the most fitting end to the bloody story of the severed crown. She eventually passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the constant, joyous noise of Vicksburg Keep, her final moments filled not with fear or silence, but with the sounds of a free people. Her life was the quiet, steady proof that the arrogant ruler's legacy of terror can be undone by the simple, profound act of caring for the least among us. The continuous flow of her story now passes to us, a reminder to listen closely, even in the quietest moments, for the whispers of history and to guard the precious, fragile gift of justice. Good night.